Now to Georgia, where Donald Trump's lawyers just asked a judge to throw out the election subversion case against him. It was the first hearing since that same judge rejected their efforts to disqualify District Attorney Fani Willis from the case. She was notably absent today. CNN's Caitlin Polantz is outside the Fulton County Courthouse. Caitlin, what happened?
Dana, no ruling, no trial date, no Donald Trump or Fani Willis physically in the courtroom today. But this hearing, are important ones in this case because this hearing is where defendants, like Donald Trump today, his team is able to argue to the judge why they think the law is not right, the facts are not right, or this case needs to be dismissed. The judge heard their argument because what it's about here is the First Amendment. They have been arguing quite forcefully that what is charged here in this case in Fulton County, Georgia, racketeering conspiracy against Donald Trump, that is just protected speech. It's things that he should have been allowed to say under the Constitution. His tweets, his speech on the ellipse, all of that does not amount to a crime under the law. Here's a little bit more from Donald Trump's attorney, Steve Sadow, in court today.
What President Trump said, speech-wise, or expressed either through his speech or conduct, which is still freedom of expression, because that's false in the eyes of the state, it's lost all protections of the First Amendment. Just the opposite. If anything, under the circumstances, it needs more protection.
But the prosecutor, Donald Wakefield, was also able to argue to the judge that this case is rightfully charged, that the law is correct here in the way that the DA's office has interpreted it, and that Donald Trump was making false statements that were lies after the 2020 election, and that is the core of the criminal activity, the criminal conspiracy that they allege Trump is at the top of. Now, the judge didn't say what he's actually going to do here. He's heard challenges like this before to this case from other defendants, said they were unsuccessful and moved the case along to trial. That is quite a possibility here because the other thing the prosecutors were arguing was let the law stand and let the intent question come down to a jury. Dana?
Caitlin, thank you so much for that reporting. I want to now talk to this panel of CNN All-Stars, Kristen Holmes, Paula Reed, and Sarah Murray. Nice to see you all. Welcome back from maternity leave.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about the trial in a second, but I just realized all three of you are moms to babies.
That is true.
That's very cool. Okay.
And we all support each other.
And back to our regularly scheduled programming. Sarah, what was your takeaway from what we saw this morning?
Well, look, I think the first thing is just the optics. This is the first time we're seeing the case get back to what the defendants allegedly did here and, you know, what's actually on trial as opposed to Fani Willis's personal life. It was probably a cognizant decision she made not to appear in person in the courtroom, to let her team, minus Nathan Wade, of course, who's no longer with them, sort of run with this. And, you know, look, I think that the Trump team made a valiant effort. Paula can talk more about this, about trying to say why everything that Donald Trump did is protected under the First Amendment and why, you know, we don't need to do a pesky thing like a trial. We can just toss this indictment out right now. But I think one of the points that prosecutors made is that a tweet itself does not have to be a crime. A statement itself does not have to be a crime. That the way the racketeering law works in Georgia, these things need to be acts that further this broader conspiracy that Trump and his allies were involved in to try to overturn the 2020 election.
As you come in, Paul, I just want our viewers to hear some of that argument from the chief senior DA, Donald Wakeford.
It's not just that he lied over and over and over again, as counsel for the defendant points out by listing all of the instances in the indictment. It's that each of those was employed as part of criminal activity with criminal intentions.
Yeah, so the Trump team is arguing, look, this was a group of politicians talking about a presidential election. That's political speech. The government there is saying, wait a second, there are limits on the First Amendment and the protections afforded to political speech. For one thing, this was false. Falsity is not a viewpoint that is protected. The Trump attorneys then say, no, the government doesn't get to decide what is true and what is false. Look, good effort on the Trump team, but this is not something that is going to carry the day. But look, the Trump lawyers, they have an obligation to file every action for their client. And I'm told that in addition to the perpetual delay strategy, they're playing a long game here. They have to file these motions to preserve them for an appeal. So hypothetically, if this goes to trial, if there is a conviction, their hope is that there'll be enough issues, enough mistakes over the life of this case that they can eventually kill this, sort of a death by 1,000 cuts, eventually on appeal.
And I will add to that, this isn't one of those cases or one of those arguments that they thought was going to change the trajectory of the case. When I was talking to them, they said, sure, we're going to be keeping an eye on it. But Donald Trump's not there. We see him in court all the time when he wants to be there, if he wants to be at a hearing. They aren't necessarily hanging their hat on this argument. But as Paula said, and as one of his senior advisors told me, look, Donald Trump is paying these lawyers a lot of money. They are being paid to exhaust every single avenue possible and to really fight for that end game, which is to delay this trial as long as possible and delay this past that November election. And they do believe at this point, particularly following what we saw with Fani Willis, that it's going to be likely that they can get this delayed past the election.
So on Fani Willis, as I mentioned, she, and Caitlin did as well, she was not in court today. This was the first hearing since that same judge said that she can stay on the case. She did speak out on Saturday about what happened. Let's listen.
I'm not embarrassed by anything I've done. I guess my greatest crime is I had a relationship with a man. I don't feel like we've been slowed down at all. I do think that there are efforts to slow down this train, but the train is coming.
I think Fani Willis has definitely a defiant streak, sort of similar to Donald Trump in many ways. And I do think that her office really views this as what was a consenting relationship between two adults that got unfairly blown out of proportion. But the reality is this is now something that is still hanging over the case. The case is proceeding. We saw that today. The focus was on the criminal case at hand and the defendants, but the judge has allowed the Trump team to continue appealing. That's something that's going to hang over her. What the judge said in his ruling, which was not very flattering to Fani Willis or to Nathan Wade, still hangs over the court of public opinion. It still hangs over a potential jury pool. And so, we'll see what happens. But I think the best thing for them was that this was a hearing that was focused not on Fani Willis and her personal life today.
Yeah, the idea that my only crime was having this relationship. Well, no one accused you of a crime, but the judge has criticized your judgment, your professionalism, and called into question your honesty. Not a good sign when you're heading into a trial like this. But what I will say for her is, at least the case is moving forward. The judge is hearing motions, and she said she's going to keep pushing to trial.
Final thought.
I think, it's both been said by them. The idea is that, yes, Fani Willis gets to stay on the case. Yes, she is defiant. But when we play this out in the court of public opinion, that was a scathing ruling that Donald Trump is planning on using.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.